It was mid-19th century England when a travelling train spotter left his inn to make his way to the top of a steep railway cutting. Edwin soon observed that the train signalman's box was below, and that the man himself was standing in its doorway with a flag in his hand, furled around its short pole. Edwin shouted, "Below there!" to attract the man's attention, the signalman looking up and down the railway line before realising that his caller was above him on the cliff. Edwin shouted the question as to whether there was a path by which he could descend, before experiencing a vague vibration of earth and wind which turned into a violent pulsation. A rapid rush of air and vapour made him start back as a train sped past below. On looking down again, he saw that the signalman was rolling up the flag which he had started waving on the train's approach. Again, Edwin shouted his request, and the man pointed some 200 or 300 yards away to indicate a point of descent. Edwin found a rough, zigzagging path carved out, which he followed down the side of the deep cutting. It was hazardous enough to give him pause about the seeming reluctance of the signalman to meet up with him. Finally, he was low enough to observe the man, standing between the railway lines and observing him as if waiting with some caution. The man's post he found a solitary and gloomy place, receiving little sunlight and an icy wind, with high concrete walls on one side and on the other a red light before a massive black tunnel. This is when the signalman asked his first strange question, whether Edwin had come from that red light, as he thought he had seen him before. The man seemed to be in some kind of dread of his visitor, but his mood cleared when Edwin insisted that he had never been in that place. Edwin commented on the great responsibility of the signalman's work, albeit in such a desolate location. The man replied that he had adapted to his routine and used his long lonely hours to learn a language and improve his mathematics, while remaining constantly vigilant for the summons of his electric bell. While they talked, between interruptions of the man's tasks, Edwin became impressed by his dedication and exactitude, and commented that he seemed very contented. This is where the signalman now stated that no, he was troubled by things that were very difficult to speak of. If Edwin were to visit him again, he would try to explain. Edwin immediately undertook to visit him on his next shift at 11 the following night. He then found it peculiar when the man emphasised that he was not to call out to him when he arrived, that he would shine his white light on Edwin's arrival. The man then asked the odd question as to whether Edwin's words had been conveyed in any supernatural way, to which Edwin replied no. The following night, Edwin made his way down the zigzag path to where the signalman was waiting with his white light on. He soon started to explain what was troubling him. He had taken Edwin for someone else the day before, someone whose face he had never seen, as that person always held his left arm across his face while waving violently with his right arm. One night he had heard a voice shouting at him in the same way as Edwin had, "Below there," while also warning him to look out. This someone else stood just outside the blackness of the tunnel, their voice hoarse with shouting for him to look out. He had turned his lamp on red and run towards the figure, calling out and asking what was wrong. Still wondering why it kept its sleeve across its eyes, he had run right up to it and had his hand stretched out to pull away the sleeve when the figure vanished. He had run down the tunnel and climbed the iron ladder, searching for the person he had seen, then telegraphed the signalmen in both directions, who both replied that all was well. Edwin suggested that his mind had played tricks on him, but the signalman then continued that within 6 hours of him sighting the so-called appearance, a disastrous accident occurred on the line. Eventually, the dead and wounded were brought through the tunnel and over the spot where the figure had stood. Edwin tried again to reassure him, claiming that the event was a coincidence, but the signalman continued. A few months after this, he had again seen the strange spectre by the red light. This time it was silent and leaned into the shaft of light, holding both hands across its face in a gesture of mourning. With a ghastly demeanour, the man recounted that the very same day he noticed in a passing train carriage a confusion among passengers, with somebody waving. He immediately signalled the driver to stop, and the braked train drifted way down the line. As he ran towards it, he heard terrible screams and crying. A beautiful young woman had passed suddenly in one of the compartments and was brought into his booth and then laid on the floor, now between them. Edwin listened, shocked and speechless, as the man continued relaying his troubling experiences. The spectre, he said, had returned a week ago and ever since had been coming and going at the red danger light. Its appearances had escalated with vehement warning gestures, calling and shouting in an agonised manner, waving and ringing his bell with a strange vibration. He declared that yesterday, during Edwin's visit, it had rung his bell twice, and both times when he looked out the door he saw it standing there by the danger light. Edwin had not even heard the bell rung then, and confirmed with the man that the spectre was not there at the red light at that moment. But the troubled signalman begged him to explain what was its meaning and what was it warning against this time. It was evident that this was a cruel haunting of himself. He worried about where the danger may be along the line, and his dilemma in not being able to notify the authorities without evidence. The spectre never informed him of where the accident was to take place and what could be done to avert it, and was obviously not appearing to any other person with more power than he, someone who could take avertive action. Edwin felt he could do no more than reassure the distressed man that he was performing his duties with exemplary care and competence, and also offered to accompany him to a medical practitioner who could give an opinion and assist with his state of mind. They agreed that Edwin would return the following day during the man's time off. The next day, Edwin set out for a walk prior to the time he had arranged to meet the signalman at his box. He crossed a field path near the top of the deep railway cutting, briefly pausing at the top to glance down. He was shocked to see a figure that fitted the description of the spectre, a man with his left sleeve across his eyes and passionately waving his right arm. Edwin's momentary horror passed when he realised that he was observing a small group of real men gathered around the danger light, which was not yet lit. A small improvised hut the size of a bed, made of wooden supports and a tarpaulin, was at its base. With mixed feelings of fear and remorse, he hurried down the zigzag path and questioned the men. The signalman had been cut down by an engine while attending to the light. He lay deceased in the small hut. The train driver, who knew him to be careful, said that strangely he had not heeded the whistle. The driver had braked hard, which as always took some distance to take effect. Finally, the driver had resorted to shouting and waving. Edwin's heart dropped like a stone as he demonstrated his call of "below there" and gesticulations. The driver had not wanted to see the calamity beneath him and had covered his eyes with one arm while waving wildly with the other, all the time shouting the very words of caution heard coming from the spectre by the signalman. Edwin himself had repeated those very same words. The prophetic apparition of the unfortunate signalman had tragically warned him of his own demise.